Welcome. Today, we're diving straight into an incredibly powerful book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, a poverty manifesto by broadcaster Tavis Smiley and philosopher Cornel West. This explainer takes us on a really unflinching journey, It digs right into the shifting economic realities of the modern era and challenges all those traditional notions we have about class, wealth, and what it literally takes to survive in the United States today. So throughout this explainer, we're going to unpack the author's core arguments about the systemic roots of wealth inequality. And look, we're not just talking about temporary job loss here. Smiley and West are pointing to a rapidly, dramatically shifting economic reality that millions of everyday Americans are facing, a reality that, they argue, is fundamentally altering the very fabric of our society. To really wrap our heads around this crisis, the authors say we first have to completely shatter our traditional stereotypes of poverty. We have to listen to the voices of the people living it right now. Take Paul, a guy from Birmingham, Alabama. He says, quote, "I'm not the homeless man down on the corner begging for change. I am anybody living anywhere USA." That hits hard, doesn't it? Poverty, the authors emphasize, has moved from the extreme margins straight into the mainstream.
Section 1. The Face of Poverty and the Rise of the New Poor. Now, thinking back to the wake of the 2007 Great Recession, the book makes a super critical distinction. On one side, we've got what they call the old poor. These are folks who are already struggling way before the economic downturn. But on the other side, we have this rapidly expanding demographic, the new poor. These are former members of the middle class whose predictable, stable lives were totally upended. Almost overnight, they found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder at the food pantry with the persistently impoverished. It's like a massive societal earthquake.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Great Wealth Divide, a systemic chasm.
The authors are crystal clear about this. This huge demographic shift, it wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. They argue it's the direct, measurable result of a growing institutionalized chasm between the ultra-wealthy and, well, everyone else. And the numbers they cite are literally staggering. 42%. According to the text, the richest 1% of Americans now control 42% of the nation's total wealth. That stat really anchors their whole argument about this massive systemic imbalance of power.
If you map out the real annual income from 1967 all the way to 2009, the divide is just stark. The incomes of the richest 5%, that top tier, just absolutely skyrocketed over those decades. Meanwhile, the incomes representing the middle and poorest classes, they essentially flatlined. They barely moved. It perfectly captures what the authors call a greased chute going down for the middle class.
So what's the fallout? Well, by 2010, the number of people living in poverty spiked to nearly 50 million. Think about that number for a second. That represented the largest percentage of long-term poor this country had seen in 50 years. The authors are quick to point out that this wasn't just some temporary dip in the market. No, this was a massive structural crisis leaving millions completely economically paralyzed.
And this extreme economic inequality, it isn't just a financial issue for families trying to balance their checkbooks at the kitchen table. The authors quote former Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis, who famously said, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." So they argue this inequality fundamentally threatens the core principles of American democracy itself. It really makes you wonder, can a true democracy even survive when power and wealth are so heavily hoarded at the very top?
Moving on to Section 3, the Stigma and the Lies, criminalizing the vulnerable.
Even with all this clear data pointing straight to structural failures, the authors note that society has a really long, deeply troubling history of blaming the individual instead of, actually examining the system. They bring up Charles Darwin, who wrote, "If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of nature but by our institutions, great is our sin." Yet poverty has been historically stigmatized and, frankly, criminalized in our public discourse. The authors argue this is actually a calculated tactic. It's meant to distract the public from the institutionalized greed that's actually causing the poverty in the first place.
Section 4. A Deficit of Morality. The Unfinished Work of Dr. King.
Smiley and West frame this entire economic catastrophe as more than just a failure of policy. To them, it's a profound moral failing. They break this deficit of morality down into 4 specific dimensions. First up is the poverty of opportunity. This is the severe lack of decent jobs that actually pay living wages. The authors argue that the old American myth, the one where hard work automatically guarantees a pathway out of destitution, is totally broken. People are out there working harder than ever, but without a living wage, they just cannot build strong family and community bonds.
Next, we have the poverty of affirmation. This one deals with the severe psychological toll of being constantly judged, ignored, and treated like a societal outcast. The authors stress that to be poor is, a lot of the time, to be rendered totally invisible. And that societal refusal to simply acknowledge the humanity and dignity of struggling people, well, they argue that's a deeply damaging form of poverty all on its own.
The third dimension is the poverty of courage, and this one is aimed squarely at our leaders. The authors point out a severe lack of bold advocates who are actually willing to risk their political careers to confront powerful corporate monopolies. Basically, they argue there's a massive lack of courage to stand up against Wall Street elites and speak the plain, hard truth about economic injustice to the American public.
And finally, there's the poverty of compassion. The authors define this as a society that reduces human life to mere market calculations, just numbers on a spreadsheet. They highlight the tragic irony here. We live in a society that will happily spend hundreds of billions on a prison industrial complex to punish the vulnerable, but then suddenly throws its hands up and claims the budget is empty when it comes to funding schools, feeding kids, or housing the homeless.
Bringing all four of these dimensions together, the authors invoke a powerful quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "Poverty is the worst form of violence." And to truly combat this kind of violence, Smiley and West insist that we can't just sit on the sidelines. We have to reignite our collective imagination and, honestly, our moral outrage to demand a completely different path forward.
Which brings us to Section 5, the Poverty Manifesto, a call for radical transformation.
So, moving from critique into actual action, the authors conclude their book with a 12-point manifesto demanding shared accountability. A few key solutions stand out from their list. They demand guaranteeing fundamental fairness through living wage salaries. They emphasize prioritizing the well-being and education of women and children through early childcare support. And, absolutely crucially, they argue we need to officially declare housing a human right to end this vicious cycle of mass evictions.
Ultimately, this explainer highlights the author's core argument, which is beautifully captured by an adaptation of a quote from Frederick Douglass: "The rich man's happiness cannot be purchased by the poor man's misery." They're making the case that the eradication of poverty has to move way beyond simple charity. It needs to become the passionate battle cry of a brand new civil rights movement.
All of this leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to take away from the source material. When we strip away all the politics and just look at the raw reality of poverty in our communities, it boils down to a fundamental choice. When it comes down to the future of our society, what kind of country do we really want to be? Cowardly and complacent, or courageous and compassionate? The choice, the authors argue, is entirely up to us.